Welcome to Mr. Biz Radio, biz talk for biz owners. If you're ready to stop faking the funk and take your business onward and upward, this show is for you. And now, here's Mr. Biz, Ken Wentworth.
Welcome to another episode of Mr. Biz Radio with me, Mr. Biz, Ken Wentworth. And we're going to talk about something today, this week that when I talked to our guest, it's been a couple of months back when he and I first spoke about this. He's written a book, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about, is some things in the book, some real life stories. But you see it so often in today's day and age in the news. I mean, it seems like nightly. I try not to honestly watch the news that often. I try to catch headlines and dive deeper into what I really want to dive into. But the idea of unequal justice, different things that are going on, and you're like, that's a head scratcher. Like, how the heck does that even make sense? Like that. The logic behind it doesn't make sense. And well, there's a precedent. And then how did that precedent ever get set? Because it just seems like unbalanced and unequal. And our guest this week has actually written a book called Unequal Justice. Our guest this week he's a certified criminal trial attorney with 35 years experience as both a prosecutor and defense attorney. So he's seen both sides of this, which is another interesting aspect of this. So many times you talk to an attorney and they've only been on one side of that coin. And I think, you know, having someone that's on the show here that's had both sides of that coin really makes a big difference. Again, as I mentioned, he's the author of Unequal Justice. And I'm looking forward to talking to this. James Porfido, welcome to Mr. Biz Radio.
Thank you so much, Ken. Thanks for having me on. It's really a great conversation. Looking forward to having.
Yeah, it's like I said, I know when we talked a couple of months back and you started to explain, you know, about your book and everything, I'm like, you can stop. Like, this is good. I got to have you on because it is one of those things that, as I mentioned, you see it so often, at least I see it so often, when you see headlines or you see something happening and you're like, is that even possible? How would a judge rule that and things like that? And a lot of these, you know, things I would call, at least from my vantage point, seem to be unequal justice in a lot of cases. Before we start diving into that, though, James, if you would tell us a little bit about your journey, right? Your 35 years of experience.
Sure.
I know now you mentioned before you're not actually practicing anymore, but tell us about that journey, if you would.
Of course. Yeah. So, of course, it all starts in law school. And I kind of detail this in the book. I talk about the journey through my career in law and some of the detours along the way that I had during the career. And it's so over 35 years at this point. And I started out as a young prosecutor and elevated through the ranks at the prosecutor's office in our local county prosecutor's office in New Jersey, Morris County, and eventually became a certified criminal trial attorney in 1995. And that's a distinction among attorneys that you've held yourself out in that particular area, in particular criminal law. And I rose through the ranks of the prosecutor's office doing vehicular homicides, heading that unit, and sex crimes and child abuse. And I was prosecuting a lot of high profile cases in those years. And then a case happened, and my involvement in that case and the people involved in the case led me to leave the career as a prosecutor, which I ultimately, became a defense attorney and was a defense attorney and handled a number of cases, high profile cases over those years, and ultimately walked away from my practice in 2023 and joined a firm. I'm of counsel with the firm. We have about 50 attorneys. The name of the firm is Einhorn Barbarito, Frost, Botwinick, Nunn, and Musmano. And we're in Denville, New Jersey, and we're a growing firm. But I'm of counsel with them in the criminal end. And along the way, I had some detours. I was a TV legal analyst and still do that. Did a lot of high profile cases over the years that I'm sure the listeners have certainly heard. They were in the public media, and they were national news, headline news. And I represented crime victims over the years, and I became involved in a number of foundations. And one, I spoke to approximately 75,000 high school students over a 2-year period about the dangers of drinking and driving and drugs and alcohol awareness. And the case in particular that led me to leave the prosecutor's office in 1997.
No, that was good. So I want to ask about that in a second, because I think that's got to be such a sharp contrast. But before we even get into that, for my own edification, I guess I'm a neophyte in the space. What does of counsel mean, James?
Well, that's a great question, because there's really no definition of that. We kind of each each of counsel is distinct in its own way. You're like a consultant.
Okay.
You're available to handle cases if the need arises. It has not. I've basically been referring my cases and speaking to my former clients that I have developed over a 25-year career or more handling private clients. So I still have a following of clients that still continue to reach out to me if they have a legal issue or a problem, and I direct them to where to go, or I'll put them in touch with the right attorneys to handle their matter.
Okay. Yeah, I was kind of envisioning that you're kind of an advisor, consultant type of thing.
Correct.
So going into that, so what was that thing that sort of really just changed things to go from being a prosecutor to a defense attorney? Because
Sure.
again, I would imagine in your profession, that's a big change.
It's a big change. They call it going to the dark side, actually.
Right.
Among the pro-state police prosecution, going to the defense is going to the dark side. And I did that in 1997, and it was the result of a case that I had prosecuted. I was doing a vehicular homicide case, and it's I talk about it in the book in detail.
Mm-hmm.
The driver was more than 2 times the legal limit of intoxication. He was driving more than 80 miles an hour, exceeding the speed limit, traveling on the shoulder and the median. And really, there were a number of people that were concerned, making 911 calls about this particular driver. And ultimately, he impacted with a vehicle driven by a mom with her 3 children in the car. And sadly, tragically, she was struck by this individual and killed. She was medevac from the scene, and shortly she was, her husband had to remove her from life support. And I got to know the husband very well. I didn't say the names of the parties, but I got to know the husband very, very well. He was an attorney, and I explained the laws that existed in New Jersey. We had these traditional death by auto laws rather than vehicular homicide. Those were kind of reserved, manslaughter charges reserved, so the listeners have an idea. It's really the equivalent of a murder, but without a purpose and intent. It's reckless conduct. Gotcha. So I explained the law that existed, and there was a possibility that this individual that had killed his wife could get 270 days in county jail, which he could not even believe that for a moment, because as he explained to me, or as he presented to me, it's the same result. If it's a gun or a knife or a vehicle, it's the same result. My wife's dead. Mm-hmm. And I said to him, look, we have enough facts here and evidence to support going forward before the grand jurors with trying to get an indictment for aggravated manslaughter, which is the equivalent of a murder without a purposeful knowing intent. And just to give the listeners an idea, probable cause is the standard in a grand jury proceeding. And it's all state-driven evidence. The state has the floor, let's say, in the grand jury. And so getting an indictment was not that challenging for aggravated manslaughter, but then we needed to prove that at trial, and we did. And the driver was convicted of aggravated manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years in state prison, 10 years without parole. And the husband was really instrumental in changing the laws in New Jersey. He was able to petition more than 100,000 people throughout the state and get a bill passed that recognized the laws as Terry's laws, named that in honor of his wife. And now the law requires that you serve a mandatory state prison sentence of 3 years, mandatory minimum, if you kill someone while driving drunk or recklessly.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I want to ask a little bit more about that when we come back after the break, James. Again, we're talking with James Porfido. You can find out more, and we'll put this in the show notes as well. You can go to porfidolaw.com or unequal-justice.com. Come back after the break. We'll continue talking a little bit more to James about specifically what he just mentioned, as well as his book, Unequal Justice.
If you would like to reach hundreds of thousands of business owners every week, Mr. Biz Radio can help. Our show airs globally 7 days a week for more than 25 hours across several internet radio stations, plus 20 plus podcast platforms. Also, video exposure on the new exclusive Mr. Biz Network streaming channel, which gets blasted to 100 plus streaming platforms, and the Mr. Biz YouTube channel, and our 350,000 social media followers multiple times every week. Join Mr. Biz Nation as an advertiser by emailing us at info@mrbizsolutions.com.
Attention, Mr. Biz Nation. We have an exclusive offer just for you. Get lifetime access to scarcity countdown timers and logic links for only $69. Yes, you heard it right. Only $69. These tools will add urgency to your email campaigns and website pages, helping you increase conversions, sales, and capture more leads. Don't miss this incredible opportunity. Visit getpulsetools.com now and take your business to new heights.
Check out all 3 of Mr. Biz's best-selling books at MrBizBooks.com. Now, once again, here's Mr. Biz.
All right, welcome back to the show again. Talking this week with James Porfido. So, James, so that case. So, I guess what was? It's a very inspiring case. Obviously, I mean, a tragic one, but also inspiring because it led to action and it led to. It sounds like positive change.
Well, even more so. The husband had started a foundation to educate high school students about the dangers of drinking and driving and drugs and alcohol awareness, whether you're a driver or a passenger in a motor vehicle, and making good conscious decisions, obviously, and exercising good judgment. And approximately 2 years after the case had concluded, he was jogging near the site where his wife was killed and he himself was struck by a car and killed. So
You're kidding me.
No. So with that news, and he had started a foundation that was really going out actively to high schools, and he was the speaker. He was the speaking board for the foundation. So I left my job at the prosecutor's office and I became involved with the foundation, and I began to speak to high school students and really took on his role. What he was doing, I tried to emulate that in some way, talk about the case, and certainly talking about the laws and the prosecution of that driver. And I impacted probably about 75,000 high school students over a 2-year period.
Wow. Well, kudos to you for stepping in. I mean, again, it sounds like he was on a mission and it was really good intentions and having some impact. And it's, I mean, I just cannot believe how the irony, the tragic irony of what ended up happening to him as well. So what was that sort of that big thing though that changed so that all of a sudden you're like, hey, I want to become a defense attorney now? Was it just the time away from that, or?
Well, it was the case itself and the impact upon, his death really left a mark on me because he was an inspirational person. And I really admired what he had done after the case. He really turned a bad thing into something very positive and trying to educate, changing the laws. That was really impactful upon me. So I think when I left the prosecutor's office, I wasn't like automatically going to be a defense attorney. That was like my option to become a defense attorney. And I slowly, I'll say developed into that role as a defense attorney, but was more so about doing what he was doing. And then I became a defense attorney, and I started to see I'll say the disparity in the system, from the insider's view, looking out just by simply moving from one side of the courtroom to the other side of the courtroom. I saw that the rules were a little bit different. Representing someone that's accused of a crime, they're presumed to be innocent, so that's your idea. That's what we all believe. It's our constitutional principles. And I didn't find that to be the case. It felt like you were automatically, your clients were guilty before there was any proceedings, and you had to undo what was being done and almost disprove that presumption of innocence. You had to prove your client was innocent rather than guilty. And that's really not the way it's supposed to be. The burden of proof is not on the defense.
Yeah, I mean, I think the court, especially nowadays and with social media and everything, I mean, the court of public opinion is so quick to rush to judgment. And I always like to see sort of the initial outpouring of a particular bad situation happens. I want to hear what happens 2-3 weeks later, because I feel like whichever side is the quickest to run out, if it's a big, high profile case, to get their side of the story out there, and it really starts to sway people. And then people might not hear sort of the other details or the context or other things that are pertinent to that case and that particular thing. So is that what led then, I'm assuming, to starting the book? And was that a long process for you to write the book on Unequal Justice?
Well, the process of writing the book wasn't that long. It really was a culmination towards the end of my defense career. I was doing a lot of criminal cases, obviously, and that was the concentration in my practice, was doing defense work. And I just found that it was getting harder and harder. It seemed like the scales were clearly not balanced, and the deck was stacked against you between the prosecution and the judging. I felt the judges were aligned with prosecutors many times, and almost predisposed to believe that the state's theory of the case was correct or accurate without having any evidence in front of them. And, and ultimately, having jury trials, in front of a jury, that also, it certainly changes your view of things. I felt that very strongly as time progressed.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I've thought about, my cousin that I was really close with growing up, he's a prosecuting attorney, and he's told me some of the things that he's had to deal with. And I would think, just along the lines of what you're talking about, James, I would think, and again, you've been on both sides, so you could definitely tell me, as a prosecuting attorney, especially with a jury trial, or even with a judge, I suppose, tugging at their emotional heartstrings is much easier from the prosecution side, obviously, than the defense side. And I mean, it's got to be difficult as a juror and or a judge to really step back and pull the emotion out of it and really think in a more logical way, especially if you have a prosecuting attorney who's really, pouring on some of those details that are all truthful, but could really sway people emotionally.
Most definitely. And there's a conception or a misconception, let's say, when people come into the courtroom and they get seated as jurors, that, hey, this person must be guilty because they wouldn't be here. They must have done something, or the state wouldn't go full bore trying to prove their case. And then, there's some pretrial rulings that the judge may be, in line with the prosecution, because it's about protection of the rights of the community. The judge doesn't want to be the one to say, hey, I'm not really accepting this theory of the case. You really haven't convinced me that this person belongs behind bars while they're waiting for their trial. But the flip side is, if the judge were to let that individual out and they were to go out and commit another crime, well, that's the judge's career reputation on the line. So I understand that 110%. I get it. But I always felt that as a prosecutor, I had that alignment. Like, I was close to the jury, I could certainly speak to them. And, my job was to convince them that that case was meritorious, that we had a right to be there, and that this person did something bad and they needed to be convicted and punished for what they did. And I didn't have any difficulty doing that job, because I always felt in my heart that I was doing the right thing, and that we certainly had the evidence to support the charges. And I can't say that was always true or is always true today. I feel there's a personal ambitions or motivations behind a case. Maybe the police are pushing, their theory of the case on the prosecutor, and the prosecutor's pushing that as well. So it gets a little bit cumbersome at times, for sure, and challenging.
Yeah, I can't imagine. We're going to hit another break here, guys, but I'll tell you, James, I'll give you a little preview, because I know the next question I want to talk to you about when we start the next segment is cases on both sides. When you were a prosecutor and or defense attorney, that you're like, man, I don't know about this one, right? This guy or girl's guilty or whatever. Again, guys, we're going to hit a break here. James Porfido, PorfidoLaw.com, unequaljustice.com.
How would you like to have direct access to Mr. Biz to help you run your business more profitably and more efficiently? At MrBizSolutions.com, you get live access to not only Mr. Biz, but also several of his hand-picked and trusted business experts, each with 20-plus years of experience to help you optimally manage and grow your business. That's just the start of where Mr. Biz Solutions begins. Learn more at MrBizSolutions.com. That's MrBizSolutions.com.
Attention, Mr. Biz Nation. We have an exclusive offer just for you. Get lifetime access to scarcity countdown timers and logic links for only $69. Yes, you heard it right. Only $69. These tools will add urgency to your email campaigns and website pages, helping you increase conversions, sales, and capture more leads. Don't miss this incredible opportunity. Visit GetPulseTools.com now and take your business to new heights.
Got a question for Mr. Biz you want answered on air? Email it to info@MrBizSolutions.com. Now, once again, here's Mr. Biz.
All right, guys, welcome back to Mr. Biz Radio. Again, talking about unequal justice. Our guest this week, James Porfido, his most recent book is Unequal Justice, The Search to Balance the Scales. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it at Barnes & Noble as well. Again, we'll put that in the show notes. But James, as I mentioned towards the end of the last segment is, do you have cases that really, that you had during your career, again, on either side of the fence, whether prosecution or defense, where you're representing someone and you're like, man, if you're a prosecutor and you're like, man, I think this guy might be innocent, but I have to build this case against them? Or on the defense side where you're trying to defend someone and you're like, man, I'm not comfortable with this because I think they probably are guilty.
Yeah, you know, I don't know that I ever really had those feelings. I was always firmly convinced in my belief in either the guilt or the state's inability, not innocence, but the state's inability to prove the case. And that's what it's about. Like, you know, because people would say, well, how do you represent people charged with such horrible things and, you know, being guilty of that? And I say, well, they're not guilty. They're presumed to be innocent. They have constitutional rights. You know, we all have them. We're protected under the Fourth Amendment for unreasonable searches and seizures, the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. The Sixth Amendment guarantees our rights to counsel. And I say competent, capable, effective legal counsel, and to confront the witnesses against you. So, you know, those are guaranteed constitutional rights. And so I'd say, look, we're all bound by the system. That's my job, to protect that person's rights. Not necessarily that they're innocent, but the state must prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And, you know, I have to evaluate the evidence and determine. And a lot of times I looked at it just as if I were a prosecutor, and I would say, what would I need to prove this case? And I think that helped me become a good defense attorney. And many times I said, the state just doesn't have the evidence to support this charge or the conviction. You know, they didn't interview witnesses that they should have interviewed. They didn't gather or collect evidence that they should have. They didn't do the forensic examination of evidence. So there were a lot of things like that, you know, that came into play. And, you know, there were certainly cases on both sides that were memorable to me that, you know, and I talk about them in the book because each one of them left an impact. And honestly, I didn't really write the book. I think the people and the cases wrote the book. You know, it was really about those experiences. And, you know, I talk about them at length in the book and, you know, chapter by chapter. And, you know, there's so many I could talk about, but one case in particular that led me to go to court TV and become a TV legal analyst was the husband had slashed his wife's throat ear to ear and tried to murder her and left her for dead in a parking lot. And she was miraculously able to get into a supermarket that was open. And they were shoving paper towels into the open wounds in her throat and were able to save her. And we prosecuted that case. The husband showed no emotion when he was you know, told about his wife. And we later learned through the investigation that he was having an extramarital affair, and which is unfortunately a typical situation. We went to trial on that case, and his defense was that he really was not of sound mind. He was suffering from diminished capacity and not able to formulate a purpose or intent to commit this act. And it was kind of a weak defense. I believed it was a weak defense. And the jury obviously accepted that because the jury was out for less than 15 minutes and he was found guilty of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to 20 years state prison, 10 years without parole. And the story kind of continues because shortly after the case had concluded, I was contacted by the Geraldo Rivera show that was big on TV at that time. And they were doing a piece on domestic violence, spouses that either kill or abuse their partners. And the victim in the case was asked to be party to that. They were asked her to come on the show, and she said, I won't come on without the prosecutor that handled the case. He needs to be sitting next to me. So I went into New York City with her, and you know, they talked about the case, and I spoke about the prosecution, and you know, that kind of led to me doing court TV. It was like it opened a lot of doors and avenues, and you know, I certainly have her to thank for that. And That was just there were so many cases like that, though, that were milestones that kind of like really touched on your heartstrings and really led to so much more. There were other cases in the book that I talked about, and I represented a man who was married for 50 years and killed his wife with a baseball bat. And you would say at first blush, what the heck is going on here? And it's exactly what I said. Clearly, he was suffering from some form of Alzheimer's or dementia, and the prosecutor refused to accept that. We had to have him evaluated, and ultimately he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. And not so much insanity, but he couldn't assist in his own defense. He believed his wife was having extramarital affairs with the doctor and anybody basically that she had come in contact with. So I felt that, although he was guilty of the offense, there were so many mitigating circumstances. Clearly, if he was of his sound mind, he would never have done this. A man that was married for 50 years.
Right.
And he was really suffering from some delusional type behavior, which the prosecutor refused to accept in the case. So we had to kind of go forward on that defense theory, which was accurate. I felt it as soon as I met with him that there was obviously some mental health issues that needed to be explored that were ultimately a defense in his case. But there were so many. I mean, I kind of outline them in the book and I talk about them. And, I know time's limited, so I can't talk about them in great detail. But there was one in particular where a young woman was sexually assaulted outside of a health club. She was robbed. And the individual was masked and had a hooded sweatshirt on, so she couldn't identify him, but she did know when he put his hands over her mouth to stop her from screaming. She smelled his hand and it had a rancid odor to it. She was able to pick a voice out through a voice lineup of 6 people. She picked out this individual's voice. He was one of these onlookers that was interested in the case and went up to one of the detectives, and the detective was smart enough to say, "Hey, can I smell your hand?" And as soon as he smelled his hand, it was exactly as what was described. And she was robbed as well. And what was taken from her were 10, a 5, and 5 singles. And when they found this individual, he had a 10, a 5, and 4 singles and a dirty pizza napkin. He had just bought a slice of pizza, and they were able to determine that he had paid $1 for the slice of pizza. So we put all of that together, and he was ultimately convicted. And the name of the chapter is The Killing of MM and Death by Prison, because sadly and tragically, the young woman that was the victim in that case never really got over this situation. She became addicted to drugs and died of a drug overdose. This individual, who was not a very nice person, went to prison, and he was killed within about 7 to 8 months after his sentence. And he was sentenced to 40 years. First, he was sentenced to 60 years state prison, 30 years without parole. And then that was modified to 40 years state prison, 20 years without parole. And, that case really it left a very lasting impression on me, as all the cases did, quite frankly.
Yeah, I can only imagine. We've only got about 30 seconds or so left, James. Just real quick. So for people out there, entrepreneurs, business owners, things like that, what did that do for you once you got on court TV and then you became like a legal expert? Did that explode your career at that point?
Not necessarily. I really still had to develop my career like anybody else. You had to go out there and actively market and promote yourself. And I built up a business. I actually talk about that in the book, is how I started based on one retainer in a criminal case. I was up for a prosecutor's appointment, left my firm and decided to go into private practice.
Yeah, interesting. Now, I'm just curious about that. You hear stories all the time about that. Again, guys, we're talking to James Porfido, porfidolaw.com, unequal-justice.com. James, we're out of time, but I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I wish we had longer.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Have a fantastic rest of your week. And don't forget, as always, cash flow is king.
To become part of Mr. Biz Nation, follow him on all social media platforms or never miss a show by going to MrBizRadio.com. If you prefer free video content, visit the Mr. Biz YouTube channel or check out his streaming channel, which is available on 100+ streaming platforms at MrBizNetwork.com.